Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. CEO, my name is Ahniwake Rose. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm also of Muskogee Creek descent, and I have the pleasure of being the executive director of the Oklahoma Policy Institute. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As we continue to come out of COVID, it is such a pleasure to be able to do things live. So for those of you that are watching us remotely, thank you for joining us. And for those of you that were able to join us in person, thank you so much for being with us and providing us your time, your space, and your energy as we talk about a really important topic for us here in Oklahoma. I want to acknowledge some of our attendees before I jump into the things that I'm supposed to say. First, Candice Jones, who is the president and CEO of the Public Welfare Foundation. Rachel Holt, the executive director for the Oklahoma Office of Juvenile Affairs. Shameca Brown with SKB Integrated Health Systems. Shelley Cadamy, who is a parent of children with lived experiences. Our OK Policy staff members, our valued friends and supporters watching online. Of course, the OK Policy Board of Directors, thank you for all you do to support our work every day. And to the staff of the museum, as always, it is a pleasure to work with you. You make everything seamless for us. So thank you so much for all of the hard work. So the issue of criminal justice reform has been a hot topic in Oklahoma for a very long time and on the minds of all of us recently, right, as we've continued to move through this legislative session. And over the past decades, we have seen major reforms through State Questions 780 and 781, as well as supporting legislation and policy changes that seek to make our justice system less focused on a punishment-first approach. Instead, advocates have been pushing to increase the availability of treatment, as well as providing successful reentry programs. One aspect of the justice system that hasn't received the attention it deserves is our youth systems. Oklahoma's youth-serving organizations are tasked with ensuring the health and well-being of children who find themselves swept up into a complex system. OK Policy has heard from many Oklahomans about families ripped apart by the system and the difficulties faced both while children were in the system and then once they've left. That's why we jumped at the chance to partner with the Public Welfare Foundation to do a deeper dive into the often unseen world of the state's youth justice system. We appreciate the Public Welfare Foundation's president and CEO, Candice Jones, for joining us for today and for participating in the panel discussion. Over the course of the last 18 months, we have talked directly with children and family, as well as policymakers and other individuals charged with helping guide these young people into the path to be productive citizens. We also took a deeper look at what data was publicly available. Our policy director, Putnam, will talk more about our findings in just a minute. But I want to express my sincere thanks to Rachel Holt with the Office of Juvenile Affairs and her staff for providing all of the assistance that they did as we were putting the report together. And we appreciate her participation in the panel discussion today, and we look forward to her front row insights onto the progress that has been made and the challenges that remain ahead. Our current state of the justice system is a product of more than a century of decisions, both good and bad, by lawmakers and those who have been charged with overseeing our state's youth-serving organizations. While our team spent a lot of time looking at the state's unique history in this report, I want to emphasize that this is not a finger-pointing exercise. It's vital that we know how we've got to this point so that we can correct our past mistakes. Our intention is to focus on the future, however, and to discuss ways that we can work together and move forward. Our children are best served when we have a laser-like focus on ensuring that our youth justice system delivers positive outcomes for everyone involved. We hope this report and the related pieces will stimulate a public conversation. How can we better support our children and their families? And how can Oklahoma make meaningful investments in our future successes? Now, to kick off our program, I'd like to welcome Putnam, our policy director, who will provide an overview of the report. Carly first joined OK Policy in 2013 as an intern, and we would not let her leave. She quickly was hired as our healthcare policy analyst, a position she held until July of 2020. Not so coincidentally, this was a month after Oklahoma voters passed Medicaid expansion, a cause she fought tirelessly for to raise awareness and has become nationally recognized. In 2018, Carly became our policy director. She supervises a 7-person team that works on diverse policy areas, including youth justice. Carly is a graduate of the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofit Management Certification, the Oklahoma Developmental Disabilities Council Partners in Policymaking, the Mine, a social entrepreneur fellowship in Tulsa, is a member of the leadership class of 62, and she is also celebrating a birthday today. In addition to discussing the report, Carly is also serving as moderator for the panel. So please join me in wishing a happy birthday and in welcoming my colleague, Carly Putnam.
Thank you, Ahniwake, and I want to say it wasn't a tireless push for Medicaid expansion. I was tired sometimes. Thank you all for being here today. As has been discussed today, OK Policy released Better Tomorrows, and analysis of Oklahoma's youth justice landscape. And in addition to the data and the policy analyses, we developed the report in large measure from interviews and conversations with Oklahoma children who have found themselves entangled in our youth justice system, with family members who love and support them, and policymakers and individuals working within a really complex system to help these youth. We heard, and the data confirmed, that Oklahoma still has a way to go. Better Tomorrows is a little bit unusual as policy reports go, in that it spends a lot of time presenting the historical context for the youth justice system as it exists today. Oklahoma is a unique state, and we need to take that history into account. From the Trail of Tears to the Osage Reign of Terror to the destruction of Black Wall Street, we have a history of racial violence and wealth theft, and little to no accountability for either. When it comes to the youth justice system specifically, we found that Oklahoma has historically been punitive and often averse to reform. To give some examples, when the federal funding became available through the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act in 1974, Oklahoma was one of 6 states that then refused to take the funding, reportedly to avoid federal scrutiny and regulations. A few years later, in 1978, we saw the filing of the Terry D. lawsuit on behalf of 7 teenage plaintiffs in the State Department of Human Services custody. DHS at the time oversaw juvenile affairs in the state of Oklahoma. The suit uncovered abuse and horrific conditions in state custody. In 1996, Oklahoma finally took the federal delinquency prevention funding that had first become available in 1974. The Terry D. case itself was not resolved until 1998, 20 years after it was first filed. Then a few years later, in 2004, the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice launched an investigation into Oklahoma's Rader Center concerning multiple claims of physical and sexual abuse at that facility. A year later, the investigators sent a letter to then Governor Brad Henry detailing mixed cooperation from the state's Attorney General. That investigation then turned into United States versus the state of Oklahoma, and the Rader Center itself closed in 2010. It's not that people didn't want to try to make the system better. There have always been people working diligently within our youth justice system to try to change things. But we also found that they had often been stopped by inadequate funding caused by Oklahoma's structural budget deficit. In 2007, then OJA Director Gene Christian warned that there was not enough money that the state wouldn't have the funds to make adequate improvements to the Rader Center building or to provide the staff necessary to keep youth in the facility safe. In 2010, HJR 1065 established the Oklahoma Juvenile Justice Reform Committee. The committee's finished recommendations, including evidence-based community programs, effective mental health and substance abuse treatment, and life skills programs, were sidelined by budget cuts. In 2015, the then executive director and chief of staff of OJA resigned in the face of 5 to 10% budget cuts. And this is not to say that also that good things haven't happened in the system. In 2020, Oklahoma passed the Juvenile Justice Protection Bill. The bill amended law to prohibit children 12 years of age or younger from being placed in state juvenile detention facilities outside of very specific circumstances. In 2021, House Bill 1799 established a process for juvenile expungement. But the point is that our systems cannot be divorced from their history or from their context. That's visible across the state. Oklahoma ranks near the bottom in nearly every category of child well-being, according to Kids Count. Oklahoma children experience more adverse childhood experiences than children in other states. It's probably not a coincidence that we lock up more adults than in other states. People of color are overrepresented in both the child and adult justice systems, and the rates vary considerably across the state. Needed money is extracted from Oklahoma households through fees and fines assessed on people who are justice involved, whether children or adults. As Ahniwake said, our present system took many years to develop into its current form. And not to spoil the ending of the report, but we're not going to be able to fix it in a year, and we probably won't be able to fix it in 2. This is going to require commitment and collaboration and intentional action over time. And it's also going to require us to think outside, specifically, the youth justice system. Our state's widespread disinvestment in shared prosperity needs to be part of that conversation. We saw in our interviews that children know when their neighborhoods and communities have been left behind. Better Tomorrows is a very long report about a topic that usually only kind of bubbles up for attention when there's a crisis or a lawsuit or both. By releasing this report now, we want to help start conversations at a time when the house isn't on fire. And by the very nature of this work, I am very sure that there will be disagreements about our conclusions, and we welcome that. Having more people working on this problem together is not going to be a bad thing. And if there's one thing that our state is proud of, it's that Oklahomans take care of each other. These are our children. We need to take ownership of this problem in order to take ownership of the solution. And we look forward to working with all of you for better tomorrows for our children. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here with you. I'm Candice Jones. I'm the president and CEO of the Public Welfare Foundation, and I am excited for this report. Public welfare focuses on adult criminal and youth justice. We do funding in 8 jurisdictions all over the country. And it's interesting because we go to places that feel like they have opportunities. Opportunities is sometimes a nice way to say challenges. But the truth is that there are no shortages of places with opportunities for change in this country. What selects for us a site is whether or not there are the kind of partners on the ground in a jurisdiction that we feel like are going to drive change. We got lots of opportunities. The opportunity here is that Oklahoma was rich with tenacious leadership. From policy shops that were willing to do a rigorous data analysis, talk about the history, and then really engage in a conversation about where the opportunities for change were, to tenacious leaders who are willing to roll up their sleeves with their partners and staff and vision another way, to dynamic funding partners who have been standing side by side with us, opening doors and being willing to put skin in the game. I am excited about Oklahoma. Any state that is willing to think about, to care about its children is on a state that is on a path to health. And what I can tell you is that every state in this country should be talking about whether or not it's doing enough for its future. So I'm going to be listening and learning more about what's happening here and what the opportunities are, and I'm going to be happy to share what we've learned in some of the other places that we're working. Thank you. And I am thrilled while I'm here to bring up Miss Rachel Holt, who is a visionary leader in a tough job. And I know because I held her job at one time in another state. And so I'm just thrilled that she was willing to be here, to be a part of this conversation, to hear from all of you, and to engage as we think about what more we can do. We see you as a partner. So I hope you feel likewise. Rachel, Holt, you guys, thank you so much.
How do you follow Candice Jones, right? That's probably my goal in life, to follow Candice Jones. I want to thank the Oklahoma Policy Institute for doing this report and for consulting with OJA and other stakeholders and allowing me to have a few words right now and then be a part of the panel. I want to thank Public Welfare Foundation and, of course, Candice Jones for coming to Oklahoma and seeing Oklahoma as an opportunity. On behalf of the Office of Juvenile Affairs, our Oklahoma's state juvenile justice agency, just to let you know, I was appointed interim director March 7th, 2020. Yeah, 4 days of not having COVID, and then everything COVID. And so I just need to acknowledge that the past few years, the state, all of our leaders, all of our partners, everyone, has really been dealing with COVID. And as a leader of a state agency charged with keeping children safe, that has been a whole other level. And so I want to recognize that right off the bat, those first couple weeks as director, I am sending letters to all judges. Hey, we're going to let some kids go. Hey, we're going to, be thoughtful about detention and not detain kids we're mad at, and really detain kids that present a challenge. And so I want to acknowledge our judges, our district attorneys, our juvenile bureau directors who have been partners in lowering that population these past 2 years, and then learning that a lower population does promote public safety, does promote accountability, that we don't need to detain, we don't need to remove every child we're mad at. Juvenile justice system the basis should be prevention, and then the deepest end should be for those kids that really need that deep end. And so I want to thank all of our partners that do that. Dr. Peter Messiah is here today representing the Oklahoma Association of Youth Service Agencies. I am a strong believer in prevention and in the work being done in the community. I would, when we talk about funding, I would like to eventually see more of the funding go in the prevention, in the schools, in the community, getting those sixth graders in their classroom and having them develop that relationship with their community partners, so I never have to know them in my system. Today I have 274 youth in my legal custody, and I think about those kids and stay up at night worrying about those kids more so than the 10 and 12-year-old that live with me. And I will tell you the 560 employees at the Office of Juvenile Affairs feel the same way. And I appreciate the history that this report talks about. I appreciate the truths that are true about our system. But I will tell you, in the past 15 years I've been in this, since I was an assistant district attorney in Oklahoma County Juvenile Division, I am so honored and excited about what the system can see and how the conversation has shifted from punishment to rehabilitation to mental health treatment to treating the whole family. And so I'm excited about this conversation, to be part of the panel, and this is the first conversation of years of this. I'm excited by everyone in the room, and I'm not even going to think about the people watching. Hi. But, when I look forward to what we have going on at OJ, just some things that we have identified, if you look at our budget request, we really need to look at that transitional and independent living for our kids, right? When we spend time with them and work and pour so much into them, and then we return them to their community and to their family that maybe isn't ready or maybe isn't the best support for them, we are not setting them up for success. And so how do we build programs for those kids to find their own path as young adults? And we're also looking at increasing our career tech opportunities for all of our kids. Our kids, when we ask what they want, a lot of them talk about career tech skills and secondary education. And so giving them opportunities to do just that. We, as a state agency, are going to become a Hope agency, and we're so excited about that. The state of Oklahoma, with Governor Stitt and First Lady Stitt's leadership and Secretary Brown, my secretary, Hope is the belief that tomorrow can be better than today and that you have the ability to make it so, like, what else does a teenager need to know, right? And so we're excited to do that training, become hope-centered, and share that with our kids and family. And then we as an agency, 2 years now in my leadership, coming out of a pandemic, we're looking at our pathway to excellence. So we as a state agency determining what our mission and vision and goals are for the agency. So again, I want to thank you for having me, thank all of my team at OJA, and then all of our partners that help serve kids. Look forward to learning and hearing this conversation. Thank you.
I'm back. Thank you all. If I can bring my fantastic panel up to the stage, have a seat. And while they're getting situated and to avoid you guys looking at them with all the pillow maneuvering, I'll go ahead and do their introductions. You've already heard from Candice Jones. She joined the Public Welfare Foundation as its president and CEO in 2017. Previously, she served as senior advisor at Chicago CRED, an organization focused on gun violence in Chicago. Prior to her work there, she served as the director of the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, a cabinet-level state agency where she supervised operations, programming, budget matters, and communications. She also served as a White House Fellow and a program officer with the MacArthur Foundation. Rachel Holt is the executive director of the Office of Juvenile Affairs, our juvenile justice agency. Her career with OJA began in 2016, and she has served the agency as general counsel and chief operating officer. She also served, as she mentioned, as assistant attorney general and assistant district attorney in the Oklahoma County's juvenile division. Shameca Brown, third from the right, is the founder of SKB Integrated Health Systems and a personal development coach and the mother of 3. Although Shameca has faced many challenges as a youth, she's worked for several years with mental health advocacy and has gained experience serving youth and families across a wide array of demographics and ages. And last on the end is Shelley Cadamy. In Shelley's day job, she serves as a partner with the Matisse Group, where she is a strategist, a consensus builder, a problem solver, and an advocate for no-nonsense effectiveness. These are characteristics she is needed as the parent of children who've been involved in the justice system. She's an advocate for foster care, adoption, mental health care, racial equity, and social justice. And I'm thrilled to have all of them up here today for our conversation. To begin, we're going to start relatively broad. How do you see the effects of the youth justice system in your work? And we'll start with Rachel and work down the line.
As you know, I'm the executive director of OJA. I started as an assistant district attorney in 2007 in Oklahoma County. So certainly see the effects in all of my work that I've done as a professional in Oklahoma. And I'll say the Office of Juvenile Affairs operates in all 77 counties. Our juvenile bureaus operate and do probation in our 4 largest counties, but we are still in those counties. So seeing it in all 77 counties, we see the successes, the challenges, and each county.
Excuse me, I think we need to turn our mics on.
Shelley, yours is on. Rachel, yours is not.
Mine is giving feedback.
Rachel, can you say something to test? Don't think we have you. No.
You can talk into mine.
Yeah. Can we jump down to, Rachel can actually pull you off for a minute so we can take a look at your mic, and Candice will jump down to you.
Yeah, how am I doing on a mic, you guys?
Perfect.
I didn't need a mic because I'm so loud. I've dealt with youth justice or adult criminal justice for my entire career. I'm a lawyer, a little stinky lawyer. I hope my mole isn't showing, because Lord knows the world is lazy with them. But I went to law school to do defense, and I did some direct representation when I was in New York City, both on adult and juvenile. Went back to Chicago, ended up at MacArthur doing a youth justice policy initiative at the time, Models for Change, which was my first foray into policy early on in my career. Because it's very different doing direct representation, one case at a time, than to moving into the impact on policy and how you can really look at how a system is functioning overall and trying to impact that. Went from there into being a White House Fellow, where I worked on reestablishing Pell Grants for youth in custody and adults in locked facilities to make sure that we were using those times where people were incarcerated to indeed be corrective. And then went and ran a youth justice system, because I think there's something to be said from working outside and saying, this is what the system needs to do, and then taking a part of your career to roll up your sleeves and saying, I'm gonna hold this bag and actually do some of that. And now I'm at the foundation and it's all we do, which is fun. Other incredible partners, like I said, who are trying to do that all the time, because I think there's so much opportunity, and we're particularly at an inflection point in the country where I think we have to ask some questions about where we want to bet our dollars and whether or not the way that we've betted them for so long is netting for us the results that we like to see. So I think it's in me, it's with me, and I sometimes wonder if I tried to run from it, if I'd get away. But
Absolutely. Let's actually jump back then to Rachel Holt, and then we'll jump back down the line again. So Rachel, would you like to take another swing at the question?
Is that better?
yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just see it, I've seen it over 15 years and across the whole state. And so I love that this report, you know, was a great overview of the whole system. And I see the challenges every day, the successes every day. You know, Oklahoma in 2017, the legislator invested in a new secure care treatment facility in Tecumseh, our Central Oklahoma Juvenile Center. So $45 million bond issue that our state invested in. And when that is complete this fall, we'll have the prettiest buildings in the country, the most natural light, and the newest facilities. But that's not an efficient use of taxpayer dollars if we are not also leading the nation in what is going on inside those buildings. So for us at the Office of Juvenile Affairs, every day we are striving to not only lead the nation in pretty things, but what the work that's going on inside those buildings.
I love that. Thank you. Shameca, how do you see the effects of the youth justice system in your work?
So I like to see myself as a grassroots person. I'm down there with the families. I'm really making an impact in doing things like working with children to teach them basic skills, to almost be a buffer to rolling into a system that could potentially suck them right in. So I do a lot of work with families, advocacy within the schools, something as simple as an IEP within the school, that, you know, their education is almost like their driving force. And if that education piece is lacked within the family generation, then a lot of kids just veer off. I've had plenty clients within sixth grade. You know, they're done. You know, they're done with school. They're done with pursuing anything within their life. So I like to see myself as sometimes a parent to these children. I have families where there's multiple children in the family, and the parents can't support them all. So I'm down there trying to find avenues and ways to help them become successful, as well as advocating for my own children and being their voice in their face. But also, I think it's important, and I do this also with my clients as well as my children. I teach them how to advocate for themselves and give them a voice, and teach them that their voices are important whether they feel like it's heard or not. So,
Thank you. And Shelley, bring us home.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So I'm a consultant. I work with business owners and CEOs every day. So you might think that I don't see this in my work, except I see it everywhere. Because workforce development has everything to do with us creating obstacles for people, especially creating them early on. So for people at home, especially if you're having trouble hiring, if you have trouble keeping people in the right seats, on the bus at your company, then take a deeper dive into our incarceration rate, take a deeper dive into how punitive we are as a state, because really what we're talking about is resources. Yep. And I don't want to speak in a cold way about people, but I did economic development for 25 years, so I think of people as resources. When we incarcerate people at an early age, we are providing challenges to opportunities. Sometimes we're taking those opportunities completely off the table. And that means we're we're taking opportunities off the table for future workers, future leaders, and future entrepreneurs. And I can't think of a worse way to do economic development than to completely obliterate a huge group of people who could be workers, entrepreneurs, and leaders for the state of Oklahoma. And so I hope the business people listening, as well as everybody else, hopefully every citizen of Oklahoma listens, because this is an economic development issue. It's a workforce development issue. It is not fluffy. It is not people feeling sorry for children. It is an economic development issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. We'll move on to our second question, and I think we'll start again with Rachel, if that's all right. One statement we heard from multiple people in the process of pulling this report together is that the state is not a substitute for a parent. And so with that in mind, what does success look like for our youth justice system?
Thank you. So for the Office of Juvenile Affairs, one of our budget requests this year was to hire 2 family engagement coordinators. We see family engagement as crucial in the success of the kids. These families all have a lot of the same common themes: high A scores, generational incarceration and poverty, and substance abuse, and untreated mental health issues, and single parent households. You know, our youth share a lot of common themes. And so if we have a youth in our custody or in our placement or even on probation, if we do not fully engage the family and figure out how we can help that family while we have their child both maybe in our custody and in their home as well, and then we're failing that child and that family and that future generation building. During COVID, one of the things we learned as we shut down from visitation, and we got a grant from the Arnall Family Foundation to buy iPads, and we gave them to all of our 2 secure care centers and our group homes. And we have continued those video visits, and so all of our children are receiving these video visits with their family, and that's just so much more meaningful than the telephone connection. But we need to push further, and we're hoping with these positions that my vision of this person is that they drive a van, and that van is full of family, that they are driving from across the state to wherever their child is. I really need to check their driver's license record. And they're on the road with those families. As we're talking about kids, and we at OJ are trying to provide them with education and career skills and thoughts of their future. If we're not helping families also attain education and career skills and stable housing, then when we return that child that we've invested time and energy and love into, then we are not setting them up for success. Oklahoma statute allows a judge to order any adult living in the household of an adjudicated child to take part in any number of programs. We haven't fully used that as a state. Obviously, there's some issues on, does that parent get representation? If that parent fails, what are the consequences? As an ADA, I did file contempt against a parent. And so there's thoughts about representation and then funding for those services for the parents, of course. But the goal for these children is to pivot them and change them probably from maybe what they've been going through in generations. And if we're not taking the families with them, then we're not going to see success.
Thank you for that. When I was many years ago, a specialist on my staff once said, we were talking about Oklahoma education outcomes, and she finally said, if you want to see our education outcomes improve, we need to be investing not just in schools, but in families. And that just lodged, I think, somewhere in the back of my mind. Candice, I'm sorry, I believe you were beginning to respond.
No, this is good. This is a great conversation because it's one that has, I think, sort of been a conversation that national youth justice has been having, and frankly, even in an adult at times, because the question really cuts to this idea of sort of what are the outcomes, and we know well that a lot of times for these systems, the outcomes are sort of just a mitigation of bad things, right? Like recidivism, that's what we talk about mostly as an outcome of a child doesn't come back, they don't present back to the system. But the truth is that for us who have kids or kids we love in our lives and family, you would never just be like, my dream for you my beloved child, is that you don't reoffend, right? My dream for you is like you win your soccer competition and you go on to college, maybe Ivy League. My dream is that you become a contributing tax-paying citizen of the place where you live that contributes to a workforce meaningfully. And so I think when we think about if we organize ourselves in youth development outcomes from that as our North Star, then what you demand is totally different. You demand the sort of quality of education and professional development program training that nets you a tax-paying citizen, right? You demand the kind of treatment, mental health stabilization in the programs that will net you somebody who can go out into society and contribute. And so I think when we're thinking about the youth development outcomes that we want to see, we need to be organizing ourselves around a set of principles that are, how do we get our kids beyond rehabilitation to true health so that they can become the kind of contributing members in society that we want to see?
And I would even add on to that, as a provider as well as a owner of a mental health agency, how are we preparing the practitioners and the other providers to work with populations on from the college level down into the field? Like, how are we preparing those providers to work with populations that may have generational trauma, PTSD, family issues, basic family issues? How are we preparing these providers to be able to support these families in a way where they're thriving and not just dealing until they grow older? How are we preparing them would be my question.
Love the line, thriving and not just dealing.
Yeah.
That's fantastic, thank you. And Shelley?
So I really struggled with this question because I am a parent. And so I want to make it clear that my experiences have happened only in Tulsa County Juvenile. And Tulsa County Juvenile is separate from OJA, and I want to be clear about that. It gets complicated. I'm not going to go into why that is. I'm not sure that I even understand. And I also want, for the whole time on this panel, I wanted to be clear that I'm wildly privileged in lots of ways. I'm graduate of Leadership Oklahoma City, graduate of Leadership Tulsa. I have a huge network. I'm assertive. And so when I tell stories, please understand that my kids might be okay because I've advocated for them. But when I sit in waiting rooms, I see parents who have no idea where to start. They have no clue where to start. And I was saying earlier before we began, I eventually started bringing my business cards with me to the waiting room of the Juvenile Justice Center because people would just break down. They would break down. And it was because they had been court ordered. And by the way, I've had one of those court ordered parenting plans because in Oklahoma, when certain counties can't figure out what to do with the kid that you adopted via foster care because they've hit a mental health wall, then certain counties come after you as a parent and attempt to terminate your parental rights, which is a whole other thing that I'm happy to talk with anyone about. But I've had one of those court-ordered parenting plans, and it involved, if I had not had a private attorney, which I paid for, I would have had to go to see a court-ordered psychiatrist, not of my choosing, and I would have had to follow anything that psychiatrist told me to do, and DHS and the court would have had access to all those records. I would have paid the state of Oklahoma over $800 a month in child support. I was a single woman with 3 kids at that time. I can go on and on and on. I had a private attorney. She negotiated a better deal for me. I completed that plan. My daughter completed none of her court-ordered plan. She ran away 13 times and once was gone for 3 months. No one knew where she was. So I would say it would be great if we could just not make it harder for families. We were looking for support. I'm always looking for support. I'm always looking to be a collaborative problem solver with whomever I'm working. But it was easily one of the most difficult times for all of us. My daughter received no resources. So let me also say, while I was I didn't sleep for 18 months because I thought I was going to lose my kids. And that was after adopting them via foster care. So let me also say, part of the reason it's so hard for parents is because it's hard for the juvenile justice system because resources don't exist. Mental health care doesn't exist, transportation doesn't exist. If you're working an hourly job and you have to go see a psychiatrist because that's court ordered, then you have to leave your hourly job, somehow get a ride from someone who probably also doesn't have a super stable income, get a ride to see that psychiatrist, sit there for an hour with that psychiatrist, and then get a ride back. You've lost your income from your hourly job, and you've maybe put yourself in jeopardy of losing that job. And that's just one of the things that you have to do as a parent. And so I would hope that we as a state would have a less privileged view of people's lives so that we're asking them to complete these plans in ways that don't harm them and their families further. I have more comments, but I'm going to stop talking.
No, don't stop talking. I'm sorry, because I know you have I'm like the kids. I don't always follow the rules, you guys.
Carry on, please. This is better than anything I could
But
engineer.
thank you for saying that. And thank you for being so frank. One of the things that's so interesting.
I haven't been frank yet, actually.
Oh, well, we're here for it. I'm ready. But it's sort of, one of the things about these systems, to your point of the goal, is that, when you think of, and I'm not going to like nerd out and get research, but when you think of sort of like
Please do.
protective factors and risk factors, the things that make you more likely to fall off track, it's like sometimes our very systems of response to things, isolation, shame. We shame individuals, we shame families at a moment when they're most vulnerable. And it's like you can't get to good, get to that better outcome, that thing we were all starting out in response to your original question, if by design, at that point of vulnerability, isolation, shame, harm is the response to it, as opposed to creating the kind of systems of support where a family can say, we're actually in a moment here, we're flailing a little bit, we need some help. So I just appreciate that, because it's like, that's exactly, we want people, families to be able to come into these conversations and say, look, this is what's going on to me. I'm in a place where actually what I need is help.
Carly, can I have 2 minutes? Is that okay? I'd love to count on that. Or to comment on that. In Tulsa County, the juvenile court interprets the privacy of juveniles very broadly. And what that means is you're not allowed to tell anyone what is happening to your family. You are not, and I'm going to start crying. I'm so sorry. You're not allowed. So again, I'm wildly privileged, right? So guess what? I talked about it anyway. And I put together, because there are lots of parents who can't. I talked about it anyway, and I put together a what if Shelley goes to jail plan. And I had 2 women friends that if they did not hear from me by 4 p.m. on the day that I had court, one of them was going to go get my other 2 kids and take them to an undisclosed location, and I'm not kidding. And the other one works in PR and marketing, and she was going to call the media. And we worked it that way for 18 months because I was threatened with jail over and over and over again, because I had a blog where I talked about the systems failures and the things that my kids had to deal with. I had a blog. I talked about what was happening on social media, not in a shamey way, but in a this is not working and we have to do better as adults way. And the court used that against me. And many times my attorney asked me to stop, and I didn't. And he's a great attorney. But I didn't stop because it's not okay. Again, people with privilege have responsibility. And it is not okay that we shame people and separate them from their network and their resources when they're going through possibly the worst time in their lives.
And I want to mention, thank you, Shelley. I come to this, as Ahniwake mentioned, I worked in healthcare policy for a minute, and so I'm used to complicated systems. When Ashley Harvey was working on this report and was laying out all of the different pieces, she had to draw me a flow chart. And it has so many different points. I cannot believe how complex that system is, and I can't imagine having to navigate it, especially in a moment of crisis. So, and I think, Shelley, you've touched on this just a moment. just generally speaking for all of you, what's something that you wish more people knew about the youth justice system in general, in Oklahoma specifically, perhaps in Tulsa County specifically, Candice, in the U.S. specifically? What is the thing that you wish more people understood?
Oh, I wish.
It can be two things.
More people, or right, I'm like, I wish more people understood anything about how their dollars are used. I mean, that's the thing about this system, and when I go to places, I always try to talk and then leave a statement. Spoiler alert, I was like, this is a system, for the folks at home, it's publicly funded. This is our money. I think a lot of times, sometimes when you're dealing with adult or youth justice, they're like, oh, privatization. That tends to be a small fraction of what we're doing in the systems. Like most of these systems are public dollars, they're tax dollars, we pay for them. And so I think understanding how those dollars, what happens to a youth, what's the local detention center, that sort of pre-trial facility in your area where they're going, what happens there? What happens if a youth is sentenced to something? Where do they go and what's going on in those places? And frankly, that's as much for the sort of public, but even for people in the system. When I was running a system, I used to love to do tours of our spaces for the judges. It's like, why don't you come and see what happens to kids after that point? Like we really, for our policymakers, it's really important for people to see, because the truth about it is that these systems actually can sort of really exist out of the public eye. And whenever that's happening, it's something to be concerned about. It's a public system, it's public functioning. It can be hard when you're in the job because you feel like you're being a wailing wall. But I always say there is nothing that is publicly funded that can be beyond reproach. It is part of the sort of, it has to be a part of the discourse. It is by design what makes it a public system. So I think what I wish people knew more was anything. Like I wish they knew something about these systems, because I think the reality is many people don't know anything.
Thank you. And Rachel, can we move to you after that?
Sure. I think, in Oklahoma and nationwide, referrals and arrest and juvenile crime is doing this, right? And that's great. And there's different theories and a lot of contributors to that. But that's really good. But I think people in Oklahoma aren't aware of what we have left. So we've gotten rid of the knuckleheads. We've gotten rid of the kids that we're mad at. We've gotten rid of the poor decision-making teenagers. And what we're left with is kids that have committed high-level crimes, that have come to us with high levels of ACEs and family and historical generational traumas, and low educational performance, most by mutual agreement or not agreement. And we take, the kids that we have at our highest level are really high-level crimes, these youthful offender crimes. And even though they've committed that high level, we're not there to punish. We're there to redirect and to rehabilitate. And of course, public safety and accountability is paramount, but so is the rehabilitation aspect. So I think people don't realize, the crimes that are committed that are within our system, but then also the importance of the prevention side and what we can do with sixth graders and going into the schools. Pivot, one of our youth service agencies, contracting for all ninth graders in Oklahoma City Public School System, our largest system in the state. And they will be going in and doing life skills with every ninth grader in that system. And if we catch them in ninth grade, then again, maybe they don't come into the juvenile justice system. Also wanted to mention, and this is funny, I wrote it down and then Candice looked at me and said, FFT, so functional family therapy is a great modality in which providers work with families and children that have kind of co-occurring substance abuse and delinquency activities or behaviors, and it's functional family therapy, so it's working with that family. The Office of Juvenile Affairs has released an RFP that's currently out on the streets, and here in the next week or so you'll find out how the grant and money for that came to be, which is really exciting. But functional family therapy will be game-changing for the state of Oklahoma, and it will allow us to train up professionals across the state. We're looking for this to be across the state, not just in our two major counties, and keep kids and families in their community and work within the family system.
Thank you. When you were talking, I see Chris Steele is here, and many years ago, and forgive me, I'm going to paraphrase badly. I think he once said, talked about what happens when we judge people by their worst moment. And I'm thinking, Rachel, with your comments, not only how do we ensure that we're not setting our kids up based on their worst moment, but also how do we help them have fewer bad moments, I think is also going to be really key.
One thing I would say,
go
and
on.
I know, again, I'm not following the rules, Carly, but
No, go on.
we have there's been a significant decline in crime and youth justice, and most of there's been some policy changes. It's also that the delinquency is down. Like, that's credit that has to go to youth, these human beings that we are all putting into the world. And that means that there tends to be higher needs youth in the system. But I think most systems, when they look hard, with public disorder offenses, we still tend to, I've seen very few systems when they analyze their data have no youth that are there, where you're kind of like, why is this youth in this system? And so I just think it's important to sort of still, even within in a system nationwide that has come a long way, to be honest with that across the board, that we can see large swaths of youth where it's like, if public safety is the real issue, then this is what we're meant to serve, but still be open to the conversation and analyzing data closely about whether or not there aren't still instances of blips in some offenses and areas.
Jumping down to Shameca, and the conversation's gone all over, so to refresh the question, something that you wish more people knew about the youth justice system in general, in Oklahoma, wherever.
So yeah, I think when I think of youth justice system, the word system sticks out to me, and so this answer may not be just directly to the.
We've established there are no
knowledge of the
rules.
system.
Yeah.
But I think the word system is a very big, scary word for families, okay? And I think one thing that I am very adamant about, even when I'm advocating for families, my own children, these parents, these families have feelings. They have emotions. They have historical trauma that they're dealing with, that they are fighting against, that they don't have the tools and they don't have the resources, and sometimes even the emotional strength to kind of persevere through. So I think when we think of a system, I think words like compassion and hope and less guilt, those things come to me. If we want to see, again, people thriving and taking responsibility and accountability, for their actions. These things are, when I think about some of the clients that I have, and they've lost hope, they've lost, they rather not have responsibility. I think of those are just default emotions that they default to because they don't feel like they even have a standing chance, So I think the most important thing to kind of recognize whenever we're building these programs or these prevention methods is understanding that these are human people that we're dealing with. We all have transgressions that we have dealt with in our life. And sometimes it's easier, or you're more privileged to deal with those things, and sometimes you're not. And as a single mom, sometimes I'm not. I have to regain my strength sometimes. So I have to teach those qualities of strength to my children to advocate for themselves. So I think it's just important to pull it down to the humanistic level of understanding that these are people too.
Thank you. Shelley, one thing you wish more people knew about the youth justice system.
Is my mic on? Is it?
Yes.
I'm going to interpret this broadly.
I would never dream of telling you to do otherwise.
So I love Oklahoma. I was born here. I was raised here. I looked at Ancestry the other day to see what generation. I think I'm the 7th generation. We've been here longer than it's been a state. And I'm raising my granddaughter now. She's 3. Awesome. So I think she's our 7th generation in Oklahoma. So I love Oklahoma. Having said that, I struggle a bit with the state that I've called home. By the way, I'm in my 5th decade of living here now. So it's been a minute. what I wish that people knew is that we are the system. It's not separate from us. We are the state. We are the government. Government is put in place to be the voice of the people. And so when my neighbors, God bless them, I stopped looking at next door because I couldn't handle it anymore. When we talk about kids in this system like they're other, they are kids, they are children. And for a state that prides itself on being family friendly, we're not super family friendly. We're pretty darn punitive. And you can see that in how we spend our money. And so I would love for my fellow Oklahomans to try to develop some empathy about children. Because I think if we can see these kids not as bad kids, I see that a lot, bad apples, bad kids, whatever. If we can recognize that the school to prison pipeline is a thing, if we can recognize that compassion and grace is something that a lot of us say we have, and actually have it towards kids, then I hope we would make different funding decisions, and that includes generational different decisions. My kids' families did their birth families did their best, but they had generational trauma that I couldn't imagine. That there were no job skills, there was no mental health services, very little support. And so I hope that we would think not in the short term, and I hope that we would stop electing people who run on, I'm not going to raise taxes for the next 4 years. I hope that we would look I hope we would regard Oklahoma's legacy in a long play kind of way instead of a year or two at a time, and fund mental health, and fund workforce development, and fund transportation so people can get to their appointments, get to work, fund education, fund a quality child care. There are so many basic things that prevent people, or hopefully would prevent people from even ending up in the juvenile justice system. And so I know that's not really the question you asked, but that's my answer.
There's a reason that the recommendations in the report go far beyond just the youth justice system, and it's for exactly that reason.
I think if, I'm highly critical of the justice system, the criminal justice system, TPD. I'm highly critical of everyone. However, I think that if we just waved a magic wand and made everything about the juvenile justice system work, if it was just full of best practices, it still wouldn't matter because it doesn't function in a vacuum. It functions along with lots of other systems like DHS and schools and mental health care and physical health care and all those things. So I don't want to put the blame on just the justice system. If you don't have anywhere to send people to get help, then okay, what are you supposed to do with that?
I think to build on that, we're going to jump over to another question. One of the things that really struck me most when this report was coming together was the breadth of the geographic disparities in referrals of children into the system. And some counties, like Delaware County or even Tulsa County, refer many more children per capita into the system than other counties. And assuming that the youth in Delaware County and Tulsa County are not uniquely poorly behaved, why might that be? And Shelley's got her face, so we'll start with Shelley.
I have so many thoughts about this. None of them are data-driven, unfortunately. So I was sharing with Ms. Holt, we had not met before today, I was sharing with Ms. Holt that honestly, my son, who's now 17, when he was involved in the Tulsa County juvenile system in the last year and a half, my attorney and I literally strategized about doing what we needed to do to get him into OJA custody, which for those of you who are not familiar, that's counterintuitive. OJA is for a higher level of offense, and I'm not using the appropriate words because I'm not an attorney. But we strategized about getting him in because the supervision and resources were so much stronger. Now, as a parent, you shouldn't have to be scrappily strategizing about getting your kid a higher level of supervision because that's what's best for him. So I'm going to tell a story very quickly. So my son, who's a lovely human, went joyriding in a truck and lost control and ran it into a house 2 days before Christmas, like you do, okay? Thank you for laughing, thank you. So clearly not a good move, right? Even the police officers on the scene said, hey, if you're gonna steal a car, don't do it in your own neighborhood. So thankfully no one was hurt. He of course went into juvenile custody. But before he went into juvenile custody, he went into their custody, but he was remanded to me because it was during COVID. So about 3 days later, and I'm sorry, I struggle with timing because it all runs together. About 3 days later, he ran away in the middle of the night, and I found out later that he ran away because he thought he was going to go to prison. And he just made this story up in his head. He didn't talk to anybody. He had nothing driving that. He thought he was going to go to prison. So and I'm going to try to make this short. It's a very long story. He took his Christmas money and his allowance, which he saves up a lot of money. He doesn't spend much, and went and bought as much weed as he could buy and started selling it to his friends. And then he took that money and bought a gun and bought groceries and holed up in a stolen car in a friend's driveway, okay? So then I call his not case manager, probation officer and say this is happening. And then I proceed to try to find my son. And I'm pretty scrappy. I hacked his Snapchat. I found out where he was. I called TPD. And that's when I found out that the Tulsa County juvenile system, their computer whatever, network, database, whatever, software, doesn't communicate with TPD's software. So TPD could not see the warrant for my son's arrest. So even though I had 15 officers ready to go arrest him because I found him and I knew that he had he was behaving very dangerously, as 16-year-old boys do, especially traumatized ones. And they couldn't go arrest him. We all knew where he was. And so I kept calling the probation officer saying, I am begging you, would you please do whatever you need to do to make sure that TPD can see this warrant? And she proceeded to shame me and tell me that she had done all she was going to do. And then and it wasn't her, she'd done her work and she was done. And then she had her supervisor call me and tell me that this was my fault, that I had not raised my son properly, and I was taking it out on them. So me asking them to complete a warrant that TPD could actually see so they could go pick up my son before he killed himself or someone else with his gun was me being demanding. Now, again, I'm privileged, so guess what? Those ladies didn't have anything to do with my son pretty soon after that, because I called my county commissioner and I called a couple legislators, and they were removed from my son's case, but guess what? They're on other kids' cases because they still have jobs. And so TPD, which again, I'm very critical of at times, TPD did what they had to do. This young man on the gang unit who was just called me out of the blue because he heard my son's name come over the radio and had dealings with him, had attempted to mentor him. He did what he had to do to get a warrant on TPD's side of things. We all went over to the house together, and guess what? My son was gone. Because he knew I had hacked his Snapchat, and he knew I was on the way because he's my kid. He knows I'm coming over, right? And so he was gone for another 2 weeks. That whole time, behaving very, very dangerously. And so my point is, I don't know why there are disparities geographically, but that is not unusual, and the police officers I was dealing with said, Ms. Cadamy, we understand, we hate this, we deal with it every day. And so if they couldn't simply go pick up my son to keep him safe and put him into custody, who knows what else happens. And I'm very thankful that they helped me and that we did eventually. Eventually, my son called me at 5:15 in the morning to come pick him up because the stolen car he was sleeping in had been towed. So that's my answer.
Thank you for that. Candice, would you like to take a stab at disparities?
Yeah, I mean, there could be a lot there in a question like that, and I am a little data nerd, so it's hard for me to take that block. You know, there could be disparities in what jurisdictions are committing youth because of judicial behavior in that district. There could be disparities because of different policing tactics in that district. There could be disparities, and this is something we don't talk about enough of, because of this thing called continuum of care. And I would like to get t-shirts printed up and wear that all the time, because I think in a lot of systemic issues, I think is what Shelley is cutting to the core to, is that what we don't have is networks of systems and communities to be able to address needs that make us less reliant on deep end systems that can't turn people away, right? Like so oftentimes, and this is, if you've ever met, a person who is a sheriff and they run an adult jail. I used to, a gentleman, Tom Dart, who runs the Cook County Jail, one of the largest in the country in Chicago. You know, always say, he's like, I'm running the biggest mental health hospital in the state. And he was like, and it's because I can't say no at my door, as opposed to some of my colleagues. And so the truth is that, we in our systems time too often, we love bricks and mortar as a society. This idea that it's like, I paid for this cinder block building, or I paid for this patrol car. It's where we bet our money. And sometimes we do that at the expense of saying, I'm gonna pay to train people to be cognitive behavioral therapists, which could be community rooted and intervene in the lives of individuals and families on the front end. I could be a crisis intervention counselor that they could call. And the truth is that level of professionalism and investment is incredibly important. I'm gonna be a part of a network of providers, right, who are providing pro-social behavioral health services to children and families. Something about that in our sort of social mind feels very soft. The reason I know this is because if you've ever been in an appropriations hearing and something's got to cut, you know what's going first? All that stuff. It feels to us like the cream, when the truth is that it's the whole cake. And until we can get in our discussions of how we think about youth justice in these systems of saying, we really need to bet our bet on strong continuums of care in this community, we're actually just setting up the conditions for an over-reliance on systems that can't otherwise say no.
I'm thinking about systems of brick and mortar buildings as opposed to networks, whether it's Shelley's network or the continuums that you're describing there, that we invest in the thing we can see and not the squishy pieces that make everything else fit.
So data and research show we could see those serving people better.
Exactly. Exactly. Shameca, would you like to take a stab at that one?
Run the question
Yeah.
again, please.
One of the disparities that struck me most in going through the report, especially when our communications team had made color-coded maps, was the just tremendous geographic disparities in youth referrals, that they were so much higher in some counties per capita and so much lower in others. And just wondering about what's driving that. Why would that be?
Yeah, when I think of disparities, I think of representation. I think of, even within my own community in Tulsa, representation is there, but the ability or the skill level or even the training to help these providers deal with certain populations aren't. We do have a CBT method that we use. Some of this trauma, though, needs deeper, more intense methods. One of the things I do within my practice is, and my goal whenever I have therapists who provide services to my clients in the community, is I want to be able to develop different techniques that they could use. Each family is different. Each culture is different, especially in the African American culture. There's some deep-rooted trauma that a CBT method, I have conversations about this all the time. It may not work, but there's other ways of bringing forth healing within communities. And I think whenever I think about just the caseloads that a lot of providers have, and keeping up with their day-to-day, their family system, their routines, and trying to keep their family structure together, it is very hard to keep a caseload of 50 clients, your own life, and then go out and get special training to help someone dig deeper. So what we're going to do, we're going to default to the very basic methods of providing services. Like I said before, not so people can thrive, but for people just to deal. People need to thrive, and the way we thrive is we get down into deep levels of healing mechanisms where people can heal. And if we don't have tools and resources to do that, we're going to continue to see people just kind of dealing. And I don't even want to say coping, because sometimes coping runs out, and you need different ways. So people evolve, people change, things change, systems change. For people to really heal, we have to find different ways that these providers and people that are really willing to do the grassroots, where they can find different techniques for different populations, different communities.
I heard your remarks land with some folks in the audience. I'm thinking about what you said there about healing and communities and contrasting that with Shelley's comments about not being able to talk about it, and then bringing that back to shame and to healing and to thriving rather than dealing.
Carly, can I just jump on hers quickly?
Absolutely.
So I love what you said. And I will say 2 of my kiddos have reactive attachment disorder diagnoses. And I say kiddos, they're in their 20s now. My middle child was able to go to Shadow Mountain's reactive attachment disorder unit when she was about 8. And I credit that with her being alive today and functioning in any reasonable way. It doesn't exist now, it's gone. If you have a kiddo with oppositional defiance or reactive attachment disorder, good luck getting help. I mean, it's worse now than when my kids were young. And so I ditto everything you said. And not only should you be able to get training, but you should be able to get paid once you get that training to provide your expertise, just like the rest of us get paid for our expertise.
Yeah. I remember you and I, Shelley, talking during a couple of years ago in state budget shortfalls when contracts were being dropped with different hospitals in the region, and you saying, if my child needed care, they wouldn't have nowhere to go now.
No, I mean, my middle daughter went to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and this is, I'm bad at time, 6, 7, 8 years ago, because we didn't have what she needed in state, and Sooner Care turned us down twice. And again, privilege, I had a state senator at the time make calls, and guess what? It got covered. But otherwise, she wouldn't have gotten that care. And I don't know where she would be now. Yeah.
So bringing that around, we're going to actually move to an audience question. What kind of mental health assessment and treatment do kids receive in OJA custody? And approximately how many children in OJA custody are receiving mental health treatment?
In OJA custody. Okay, so for Office of Juvenile Affairs, kids that come into both our probation and supervision and then our custody level receive assessments. We use the YLSCIMI to look at risks and background and different things that they might have in their background, and that should drive their treatment plan in the community or their treatment plan and placement. For us as Office of Juvenile Affairs in the community, we use our youth service agencies as providers. Within group home placement, our contracted group homes, which is a level of care for kids in our custody, they have individual and group therapy every week and family therapy as well, and life skills programming. They are monitored by a psychologist and should be monitored by a psychiatrist for medication needs. In our 2 highest level, Southwest Oklahoma Juvenile Center in Manitou and Central Oklahoma Juvenile Center in Tecumseh, are secure care treatment centers that the Office of Juvenile Affairs operates. We have a psychiatrist that monitors their medical and medication needs as far as psychological needs. And then we have staff psychologists that monitor their treatment programming and behavioral health clinicians that work on this programming both on an individual basis and then in group. We find, our goal to lead the nation in treatment, you have to know that each kid is unique. And as Shameca talked about, each kid is unique, and you have to find what's going to work for that kid. And you might have to change that. We have teenagers, right? So like, I am blessed to see these kids that when we have them in our system, I mean, just the maturity that I get to see them have, but we need to adapt the treatment programs from being an immature teenager to a young adult just in their time with us. So we need a more, we're trying to be a robust program within our system, but certainly the state as a whole needs additional mental health services. I'm really encouraged by OU Medical Center. They're going to stand up an inpatient mental health treatment for adolescents. It received ARPA funding, so I want to thank the legislators for seeing the importance of that. But that's, as we're losing programs, we need to be building programs.
And an audience question aimed at Candice. Have you seen other states and cities that use restorative justice with the juvenile justice system effectively fight the risk factors that you spoke about?
That's a lot of question.
It is.
I think I have seen states.
You can take any bite of that.
Okay, I was like, all right, let me read. I'll be honest about it. I've seen states do things well. And I love the point. There's no one size fits all anything. The difference is whether or not we're given enough scratch to do something else, right? And I have seen, what I think is most notable is that I've seen jurisdictions try to bet on building a good continuum of care. When you look at Alameda County and Oakland and the work that they've done on really putting investments into Oakland Unite, right? They've sort of bet big on saying that we want to have sort of pre-commitment treatment for our youth and families. And they've done it in this way that I think is sort of brilliant by saying, and we're going to do that by investing in the professionalism of community-rooted people so that it's also a workforce development opportunities in some communities that have been traditionally left behind, right? So I think that's been really important in places like Arches in New York City, a program that was funded, with a lot of the ARA funding at the time, at another sort of big federal investment of cash that came more than a decade ago. They did a lot of investments in a continuum of care out of their probation office, and they were creating these centers all over in the zip codes. Everybody knows if you're running the system, you know your zip codes. They were putting that money, those resources back in those zip codes to sort of build community programs, build credible messenger programs in those communities, and I think they saw a real investment in that. They replicated that work in DC, and I think that they have felt that that's really helpful there. So you see pockets of it. Ready Chicago is another example happening, not specifically for youth actually, but for adults, about putting this real investment in cognitive behavioral therapy and workforce development as a side-by-side program. So you can see examples of it in other jurisdictions, but the thing they have the same, Colorado, with some of the stuff they've done to reinvest dollars, it's been about whether or not jurisdictions are willing to say, we're gonna start to put some of our dollars into this continuum of care in a meaningful way. And yes, the places that have done that have netted positive results.
Thank you. Appreciate you jumping on that question. Would any of the rest of you like to talk at all about restorative justice, any other piece of that question? If not, I will ask the audience for questions. You all immediately looked at the audience. So, and there's, I don't know if you all can tell, there are some very bright lights happening right here. So if anyone from the audience has a question and not a comment, please, this old school classroom, raise your hand. And I'm going to do I will repeat the question into the microphone. So I apologize in advance.
So this is something that Director Holt and I have talked about from time to time. I didn't hear anyone talk about the attorneys representing these kids.
Yeah.
And what disappoints me over and over is that when we are working on an issue with a particular kid, the first thing out of my mouth is, where's this child's attorney? And that just disheartens me so much. And your point about you could, rattle cages and you had the resources is wonderful, but for the majority of these kids, they do not have an advocate. And their parents are flailing and scared and all the things you've talked about. And so I would love to hear thoughts about a robust system where children are represented in a meaningful and robust and zealous way.
Thank you. And again, the lights are very bright. I'm fairly sure this is Annette Jacoby. Okay. From the Oklahoma Commission on Children and Youth, asking about representation for youth, specifically legal representation for youth in this system. How do we ensure that we have effective and robust advocates for kids? Did I summarize more or less appropriately? All right. I'm anxious to hear all y'all's thoughts.
I think I would start and say is, whenever I work with clients and families who even hear legal anything, they're spooked, right? So even when it comes to representation in that manner, it looks different. This person is here to help me get through this, but it's still a scary thing. So one of the things as an advocate that I try to teach outside of the finances of taking care of this priority legally is I try to teach them how to see this representation from a different perspective. And it's not, these people are here to help you. They're here to guide you. This is how you advocate for yourself whenever you have a question or a concern with a legal representative. So I think from just like the grassroots level, I think there's also a disconnect, just like we see it with police officers, there's a disconnect there within with attorneys, like I said, outside of finances, of even affording. I've had friends who there are more affordable ways, but there still is what I call wonkiness between that client and that attorney of kind of developing that communication on what their needs and not necessarily what they need in their pocket and what this client is kind of going through and how they see it versus how the attorney feels like that they could walk this client through those steps of representing them. So there's still a disconnect there from what I see.
Go ahead.
No, thank you for that. That's an honest question, and I feel like that is a whole nother panel. Galt was the case, In re Galt was the case that guaranteed that youth had the right, like adults, to counsel. And I think that, this is the ugly truth of it, and so I'm not gonna, it's like, we haven't fulfilled that. I mean, in some jurisdictions, you have a public defense system. The truth is that in some rural jurisdictions, you really don't have a robust that's a struggle. It's not just a struggle in Oklahoma, but it is a dangerous one, and it absolutely impacts outcomes. You don't have a public defense system. You contract attorneys getting cents on the dollar to represent. Even in some public defense systems, you want to talk about caseloads. Somebody holding multiple hundreds of cases is really at a disadvantage to be able to do something that they're supposed to be doing, which is called zealous advocacy. It makes it really difficult. And so having conversations about whether or not there's a fully funded public defense system, the real kind of sort of fulfillment of In re Galt that we should see is a conversation that absolutely, you would need to engage in, because again, like not having a continuum of care on the front end, all those things becomes the gap that shift the burden to like, oh, well, it's OJ. You are advocating to get your kid at OJ. It's not surprising, but it is heartbreaking because that's exactly what happens. Because it's like, if I want to get the cognitive behavioral therapy or I want to get that school program, that's where I have to go to get it. It's like, that is both sort of the deepest end part of the system and the most expensive way to respond to that issue. But you see it, and certainly oftentimes the amount of money going into public defense systems is not comparable to what we see in our district attorney's office, which is also dangerous because if they are by design supposed to be comparable actors even in places where they exist, if that funding doesn't represent equal, it makes it difficult for that. And so those are truths we don't talk about a lot. So I think that's a great question.
I have comments, but I haven't done due diligence on any of these ideas. So when I was adopting my kids, and I'm trying to remember how this worked. It was through a nonprofit here in Oklahoma City because I adopted in Oklahoma County. But private attorneys would represent the kids. And does anybody know what that is?
Lawyers.
Guarded ad litem, aren't
The
they?
lawyers for
No,
children.
lawyers for children. No, it was not, it was less, it was,
Formal.
yes.
Yeah.
So Lawyers for Children did a great job, and we were assigned a lovely man who just happened to be the managing partner of a very large Oklahoma City law firm. And it was awesome because he was just as confused as I was. And so we learned together because he was used to suing major corporations. Like, this was not his thing, right? And what I loved about that was it helped him develop empathy. He learned about how just very interesting the system was. And he's someone who could do something about it, right? He's an attorney. He works with other attorneys. I loved that. I wish that we could do, and maybe we already do this, I wish we could do something like that in juvenile law. You know, ultimately, it takes money. Actually, he was a volunteer. But, you know, even just coordinating something like that takes money. I also think that sometimes the communication systems fail between all of these organizations. So I've been at the Juvenile Justice Center when there was no attorney and no parent. And I have a hard time believing that both of those people just didn't show up. And so I think about, like, did someone not get an email? Did someone not get a phone call? Did somebody check a box that they shouldn't have checked? Because, you know, any of us who've worked in organizations know that a lot of those kind of communication systems have a lot of room for human error. So I would love to look at the systems. I mean, frankly, if we could just text people, if we could get an automatic text that says, hey, your kid has court Tuesday at 4, and if you can't make it, click a link. I mean, Target does that. Can we not do that? Sonic does it. Like, can we not just text people and say, are you going to be able to make it? We don't have systems like that. We have clunky, old systems that we haven't spent money on. I'm just going to always come back to money. We need to fund things properly.
One of the recommendations we make in the report, which I think ties to something that you just talked about, is how we have a dearth of attorneys who have expertise specific to the youth justice system. That it's a very weird system that operates under a completely different set of rules. And having attorneys who are part of that, who understand the system and its ramifications and can act within it, we don't have enough of those. And so one of the recommendations we have is just increasing access to legal education.
I will also say that why would you want to be? Why would you want to be an attorney functioning in this system? Who's going to pay you? I mean, how many
That's
people,
one of the other pieces we talked about.
Yeah, I mean, how many people are going to hire a private attorney in the juvenile justice system? Not that many. It doesn't even make sense.
You know, it was something else when we were working on this report. I had come across a resource from, and I'm not going to try to name the specific professional organization, but it was a document, I believe, from 1982 about the crisis among our public defenders in the juvenile justice system. It could have been written 3 weeks ago. It felt like exactly the same, that there just was not access to the funding to support everyone at the level needed. And I'm sorry, Rachel, I think you've started to say something about twice now.
You know, if I could, I want to thank Director Jacoby for her question, and that's, I appreciate all the recommendations in the report, but that certainly, that was one of the recommendations in the report, to increase the ability and skill level of defense attorneys. My mantra, even as and while a DA is that juvenile justice is justice for juveniles. So in my time at OJA and my past 2 years as directors, I've been looking at the data and looking at, you know, Delaware County and Tulsa County and all the different counties, and my goal, which I'll probably, I hope to achieve, but it'll probably take more than me, is that every child that touches that juvenile justice system is treated equally. So stands before a judge that is trained in juvenile justice, stands in front of a district attorney and a defense attorney and a probation officer who are well trained in best practices and in brain development. When I was a DA in Oklahoma County, you know, Oklahoma County has a strong public defender system within the juvenile justice system, within that building, and so they're able to go see their kids in the detention center, and that's a great system that I knew. At OJA, I hired my former public defender foe, Ben Brown, as our general counsel, and I got a lot of stuff for that. You're hiring a public defender as the general counsel of OJA? And he and I were against each other on 85% of our cases, and you learn very early in the juvenile justice system. This is not This is not Scandal. This is not how to murder or whatever. I don't know.
How to Get
It's
Away
not-
with Murder?
Yeah, How to Get Away with Murder. You know what I mean? This is not the aha moments and the Perry Mason moments. Juvenile justice, when done correctly, is a collaborative process. Kids make very dumb defendants. You know, you spoke to your set. I mean, when you read their police reports, you're like, oh man, you were caught with it, like you admitted to it. Like, there are very few cases that go to trial. There are very few cases where guilt is on the table or not known. And then because the outcome is, you know, a deferred, a probation, or OJ custody, and then OJ determines that placement, there's not real high stakes. So it's not as sexy for new ADAs or new defense attorneys to get into and to understand, because they want more action. But for those that are committed to the system, that believe in that collaborative process, that believe it takes everyone to come together to have good outcomes for these kids. When I was a DA, I used to say to the kids, I want to close your case. That's my goal, to close your case successfully. I don't want you to have any more cases. And I was their DA, and when I tell our kids in our custody right now that I used to be a DA, and they say, what kind of DA were you? And I say, whatever kind of DA I needed to be. Some of them, I was like schizophrenic. Wednesdays I had 60 cases, and one kid I was really mean to, and one kid I was mothering and hugging. You know, it's what those individual kids need. But I was blessed to have a full-time defense attorney in the Public Defender's Office going against me. And as Ben Brown is our general counsel for OJA, as we're coming out of COVID or still in it or whatever we are with COVID, we are working. And he is my bulldog, and he makes phone calls every week to judges, to district attorneys, to defense attorneys, saying, hey, you know, let's do this, what about that? And so we are working on building our training platform to engage, train, and inspire people to come into the juvenile justice system.
Thank you so much. I believe we had one more hand, oh, two more hands.
Is there any work that's been done in justice experiences, like taking advantage of the school day and time and giving these resources? We come from rural Oklahoma, and so when we talk about lack of resources, youth most times the school is their resources for eating, just for getting care that they need, those resources. And so, and when many of them go home, because some of them do live out in the country, and even if we do have programs after school,
Yeah.
or they're doing the summer, many can't get back up there to take advantage of those things. So we really need to take advantage of that school day and time. We're currently 4 days a week. We got people going back to 5 days a week. We work in the school, so we most definitely see that there is opportunity to do for our programs in the school. So there are opportunities to provide youth leadership and professional development, to provide some of these things that we're talking about, because we're doing it so we know that, again, how can we work that and get that done. But I was interested to know if there was any schools or someone that's already doing that, and anything that we can look into to say, hey, this is being done, what can we do to maybe, provide this in our areas?
I'm going to paraphrase into the microphone so our streaming folks can hear, and I apologize, I'm going to do my best, but question was about bringing the sort of resources that we've been discussing into schools during the school day, particularly for kids in rural areas where the school is where all of the resources are, and how do we, and asking specifically, I think, about cases where this has been successfully incorporated into schools, ideally in rural areas.
I think from my experience, a lot of my work has been working with particular schools in Tulsa County. I think what I see is a lot of times that it's a school by school basis. You have this large school, you have this leader of the school, and if they choose to have those services within their school, that is something that they choose. They have the choice to have. What I do see is that when providers do go into schools, it is more of a pot-off to the providers and less a collaborative thing like you're saying. what I would say to that is that when we talk about systems, if we're going to create a system, we could definitely see a need for a system to be created, to be implemented within the school, where it's not necessarily a choice. And I say that because I'm always advocating. I have just a quick story. I have a very strong-minded daughter, and she's very confident within herself. She's going to advocate for herself, and she's going to advocate for her friends. She's a true leader, and so I'm always advocating for her whenever she digs herself in the hole, because her personality is so strong and so bold. She seemed to be almost a problem child, to be honest. So my first questions to the school as these issues occurred were, what kind of social emotional learning techniques do you guys have here? And I did not receive a response. So as things came along, I would ask the same question. What kind of social emotional learning techniques do you guys use here? For one, it's been 2 years of COVID, you know. These kids are in their own culture, in their own vibe, in their own areas. You know, kids attract things very quickly, especially off of social media, and they're bringing it back to school. So what kind of things do you have in place where these children can come back to school, develop a routine, but also understand how to connect with one another on a level where if there was another issue where we had to dismiss for another year, that they could come back in, transition in, because there's already a system in place of how we connect with people that we're going to be with throughout the day, right? This is no different from the culture that we have at work. We have a work culture, and everyone goes by that. That same culture needs to be implemented within the schools, so I definitely agree with that. And if we could do it on a systemic level, where it's kind of placed and dropped in, I think we would see more success within the school utilizing those social aspects as well as those resources, because resources are there. A lot of times it's hard to ask a teacher to educate my child as well as follow the guidelines that you have as a teacher for the state, as well as get them a resource to get some food as well. You know, that's kind of burdensome on the teacher for them to have to do that. So I think if we had a system within the school and kind of almost put maybe a social program that is embedded in the culture of the school, I think it'd be very beneficial.
And I think we can do one more question.
Can I answer her? Are we
Quickly.
done? Okay. Look, are you South? Is Hugo South? Okay. Workforce Board, Chamber, Economic Development Organizations, talk to them about internships and mentorships with the local industry. I think your tech center, I'm guessing you already know that. But reach out to those entities, and I can talk with you when we're finished to give you more detail. Okay.
Thank you all so much. This is amazing, and I think such an important jumping out point for further conversations. One question I have is, how can we use private dollars to fill gaps while still holding our public funders accountable for investing in improving systems like this?
I'm going to repeat the question into the microphone, sorry. The question was, how can we use private dollars to fill gaps while still holding public funders accountable for these systems? Correct? Awesome.
I can take, okay.
I think that's you, yes.
That's softball, right, for me, perfect. I think a good way to use private dollars is for innovation, to test things, you know. So it's really an opportunity to say, we want to see if something works. It's a demonstration project. We want to see if we can build out in a community a sort of mental health crisis response for adolescents, right? We want to test that. And then the way to keep public funders sort of accountable is that it is not a private function to do that into perpetuity. It's to test a thing and then to say, look, when you do this, this is effective. Now we should do this, right? We want to stand up FFT, right? Let's see if we can get private dollars to go do the train the trainer programs for the FFT counseling, bring a team back, track how it works with some states, and then say, actually, this is effective. Like, we want to scale this. We want to use public dollars for that. I think it's a really important way to use, strategically private dollars, is to say, we're trying a thing, right? We are in this space really sort of testing out a thing. But then the way you keep public dollars, it's like, you don't test forever, right? Once you know that you got a thing and you really want to implement it, you do it. And that's how you start to say, actually, guys, we want to move past this bricks and mortar. We have these private innovations on some of these programmatic things that can be really effective. And I think that's the best way to think about them.
I'm tying that back to when your earlier response to when asked, what's something you wish someone knew, and you said, anything basically, is the public holding their policymakers accountable for, we know this works, we want it here.
Right.
I think Tulsa does a very good job of initiate this. I think the responsibility of the public kind of falls off. I've worked in incubative projects where these are created to implement in the public, but then the private funder ends up creating a whole program centered around this issue, and it kind of alleviates that responsibility from the public sector. And I think, like you said, like if we can find a way where the responsibility isn't really taken away, but the responsibility is almost meshed in, like we incubate them, but we also transfer them over to the public responsibility. And then we teach these public providers or leaders or whoever, we teach them how to do this very same project within the community where it's effective. So we don't necessarily allow that problem to be the private sector. We just use them as a way to develop these resources.
Thank you so much. And Shelley, I'm sorry. Thank you all. I think we did go over time by a bit. So if I can have a round of applause for our panel. And I'm going to call Ahniwake back up, but I also know that we have the room for like 10 minutes after this. So circulate, get to know each other, and we're going to fix everything. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Carly. Happy birthday again. And please join me in thanking Carly and our panel one more time. Thanks. So, little known fact, I was a director of government affairs in a really fancy place in Washington, D.C. for a hot minute. And as all good director of government affairs, I know a little bit about everything, right? And at one point in time, OJJDP, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, was coming up for reauthorization. And my board told me to work on that. And I said, okay, so as all good government affairs people do, I go to the originating law, I read what it's all about, and I become steeped in what OJJDP does. And it was from that moment that I became utterly fascinated with what was going on in youth justice. I had no idea. And at that point, I was working in Indian country, and that's a whole other issue that we didn't have a chance to talk about today, and I'm hoping we do have a chance right in the near future, but became fascinated with the issue and worked a lot, as much as I could do in that role, right, to make it a more robust conversation. So when I came to the Oklahoma Policy Institute and the board asked me, what is the one thing that you think that we should work on that we're not? And I said, youth justice, hands down. And that was 2.5 years ago. I'm so grateful that a funder believed in that. I'm so grateful that the staff at OK Policy trusted me to lean into that. And I'm really thankful that the board agreed with that. I think we can see from this conversation that shining a bright light into that system is desperately needed, and we all come to a better place when we do it together. And just the fact that we have this really robust panel, the folks that are here, and the questions that we've already received online proves that we're all wanting to stand up and stand together for our children. So thank you for doing that. And as all good EDs, I have to close by saying, if you would like us to continue to do this work, we would very much appreciate your ongoing financial support for the Oklahoma Policy Institute. Before we leave, I do want to acknowledge one very important person in the room that we haven't had a chance to say anything to, and that's Ashley Harvey, who is the author of this report. Thank you. She has spent over a year diving into and looking at the data and the systems. And so, Ashley, thank you very, very much for everything that you've done. You have really pushed the conversation to a completely different level for not only your organization, but the state, and it's deeply appreciated. All right. With that, you can absolutely find a copy of our report online at okpolicy.org. If you would like to rewatch the event, I know it's going to be posted on our YouTube channels very shortly. And with that, thank you all very, very much for joining us today. Goodbye. Wodo.